Hello, everyone. Today on Reading Culture, we are going to be looking at a similar idea to what I looked at in my interview with Jonathan Pajot, where we were looking at the idea of the martyred hero, or even the passive hero, you could say. Today, we are going to be looking at A Man for All Seasons, a play by Robert Bolt from the early 1960s. This play is about a fairly famous character, Sir Thomas More, served under the famous King Henry VIII and ultimately ran afoul of the tyrannical king. We're going to be investigating how his heroism manifests itself, not in the kind of active way that slays dragons, say, but rather in the kind that passively resists. So let's begin by looking at the history to this play. It's a very famous story. Many of you will probably know the general historical background, but perhaps not some of the more intricate details. So Henry, before he was the famous King Henry VIII with his 6 wives, was Prince Henry. He was not meant to inherit the throne. He had an elder brother, Arthur, and Arthur was to be King of England. Indeed, his father had arranged for Arthur to marry Princess Catherine of Aragon, who ultimately will be the aunt of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and King of Spain. This marriage takes place, but it seems was never consummated before Arthur died, leaving Henry not truly prepared for the throne as now King of all England. It was very important politically that the alliance between England and Spain be maintained, as it usually was through dynastic marriages in this period. As a consequence, the marriage, which had been to be between Catherine and Arthur, was instead now made between Henry and Catherine. But there was a slight problem. You see, traditionally in Jewish and Christian morality, going back to the biblical Old Testament, there had been a prohibition against a brother marrying his brother's wife. However, the Pope of Rome was appealed to, and he granted on his authority a special dispensation, saying that because the first marriage between Arthur and Catherine was not consummated, that she could marry his brother Henry. And so it was. She was a little older than Henry, and there was certainly not a match of love, but they respected each other, and they had she got pregnant several times, and it produced one daughter, a daughter who later on would be Queen of England, known as Bloody Mary. But most of these pregnancies resulted either in miscarriages or stillbirths, or in children which only lived a few days or perhaps a few months before they died. In other words, she was not able to produce a male heir, and in this period, to be unable to produce a male heir was considered to be barren. Now, Henry eventually fell in love, or so it seems, with a young lady named Anne Boleyn, whom he not only wanted to marry for reasons of his personal feeling, but also so that she could provide him with an heir, which Catherine was unable to do. Now, it was not unheard of for monarchs to be given dispensations for annulment for the sake of preserving their dynastic succession. However, the Pope would not grant it, either because he was under the control of the King of Spain and the Emperor, or because he honestly didn't think it was the right thing to do. In any case, this is going to precipitate the situation at the beginning of the play. And it's important to note that while the reasons for Henry's actions in this period, and indeed in this play as well, are often self-seeking and self-aggrandizing even, nevertheless, it's important to understand that Henry's conscience seems to have been truly tortured in this situation. He seems to have honestly believed that he offended God. Indeed, in the Old Testament it says that the punishment for marrying your brother's wife will be childlessness. And that is what he feels like he is truly suffering, despite the fact that he has a daughter. But there is this sense with Henry that his conscience is being troubled. As we are going to see, a matter of conscience is going to be the key issue for Sir Thomas More. So if you look at the introduction to the work by Robert Bolt, we get some very important information about why he wrote the book and what precisely he was trying to accomplish by writing it. And this is important to know because it's not obvious why a man like Robert Bolt would choose the subject matter that he has for this play. If we look at page 10 of the preface, we start seeing a bit of what he's going to focus on, which is namely this idea of the individual. So he writes, "When we ask ourselves, 'What am I?' we may answer, 'I am a man,' but are conscious that it's a silly answer because we don't know what kind of a thing that might be. And feeling the answer silly, we feel it's probably a silly question. We can't help asking it, however, for natural curiosity makes us ask it all the time of everyone else. And it would seem artificial to make ourselves the sole exception. Would indeed envelop the mental image of ourself in a unique silence, and thus raise the question in a particularly disturbing way. So we answer of ourselves as we should of any other. This man here is a qualified surveyor, employed but with a view to partnership. This car he is driving has 6 cylinders and is almost new. He's doing all right. His opinions, etc. And so on, describing ourselves to ourselves in terms more appropriate to somebody seen through a window. We think of ourselves in the third person. To put it another way, more briefly, we no longer have, as past societies have had, any picture of individual man, Stoic philosopher, Christian religious, rational gentleman, by which to recognize ourselves and against which to measure ourselves. We are anything, but if anything, then nothing. And it is not everyone who can live with that, though it is our true present position. Hence our willingness to locate ourselves from something that is certainly larger than ourselves, the society that contains us." This is a very important passage for understanding what he is doing in this particular play. In many ways, what it is about is the individual in society, and how the individual functions in a society when the values of that society are no longer those of the individual. And this is the attraction of this character for Bolt. So, also in this preface, Bolt is going to essentially make an apology in the sense of defense as to why he is writing this play about this Christian, this Catholic saint. So Robert Bolt is not, right? He was atheist or agnostic, kind of left-leaning activist in the 1960s, right? Not particularly sympathetic in many ways to the Catholic point of view, and yet he chose this particular saint of the Catholic Church as the hero of his play. And so he feels like this needs some kind of defense. Why is he appropriating something from that tradition in order to tell his own story? Well, he makes the defense in the preface, and it'll tell us a lot about the nature of how he sees the character of Thomas More, particularly the nature of his heroism, perhaps. So he says, "This brings me to something for which I feel the need to explain, perhaps apologize. Moore was a very orthodox Catholic, and for him an oath was something perfectly specific. It was an invitation to God, an invitation God would not refuse, to act as a witness and to judge. The consequence of perjury was damnation. For Moore, another perfectly specific concept. So for Moore the issue was simple, though remembering the outcome it can hardly have been easy. But I am not a Catholic, nor, even in the meaningful sense of the word, a Christian. So by what right do I appropriate a Christian saint to my purpose? Or, to put it another way, why do I take as my hero a man who brings about his own death because he can't put his hand on an old black book and tell an ordinary lie? For this reason, A man takes an oath only when he wants to commit himself quite exceptionally to the statement, when he wants to make an identity between the truth of it and his own virtue. He offers himself as a guarantee. And it works. There's a special kind of shrug for a perjurer. We feel that the man has no self to commit, no guarantee to offer. Of course, it's much less effective now that, for most of us, the actual words of the oath are not much more than impressive mumbo-jumbo than it was when they made obvious sense. We would prefer most men to guarantee their statements with, say, cash, rather than with themselves. We feel we know the self to be an equivocal commodity. There are fewer and fewer things which, as they say, we cannot bring ourselves to do. We can find almost no limits for ourselves other than the physical, which, being physical, are not optional. Perhaps this is why we have fallen back so widely on physical torture as a means of bringing pressure to bear on one another. But though few of us have anything in ourselves like an immortal soul, which we regard as absolutely inviolable, yet most of us still feel something which we should prefer, on the whole, not to violate. Most men feel when they swear an oath, the marriage vow, for example, that they have invested something. And from this it's possible to guess what an oath must be to a man for whom it is not merely a time-honored and understood ritual, but also a definite contract. It may be that a clear sense of the self can only crystallize around something transcendental, in which case our prospects look poor. For we are rightly committed to the rational. I think the paramount gift our thinkers, artists, and for all I know our men of science, should labor to get for us is a sense of selfhood, without resort to magic. Albert Camus is a writer I admire in this connection. Anyway, the above must serve as my explanation and apology for treating Thomas More, a Christian saint, as a hero of selfhood. So this is a very important passage. So he's defending this choice. Why am I choosing this Christian saint as my hero? And he's focusing specifically on how the story is going to end. Right? So the basic premise is that Moore has to sign a document. He has to make an oath. But an oath and a signing of a document which will require him to swear to something which he does not believe. And this he refuses to do. And this is the key thing, which Bolt finds so fascinating. So for him, he feels that the modern world has lost its sense of selfhood. But for Moore, the fascinating thing is he has a very clear sense of self, a part of himself which he will not surrender even to the point of death. And so in that sense, the heroism that he sees is not a religious heroism per se, maybe in the specifics, but for Bolt, for the playwright, he is a hero of the self and of selfhood. And this is going to be important to look at as we progress through the play, to see how does Moore form his selfhood and how does it interact with the society around him. One of the symbols, also in the preface, that Bolt explicitly talks about is he says, I used for this theme a poetic image. As a figure for the superhuman context, I took the largest, most alien, least formulated thing I know, the sea and water. References to ships, rivers, currents, tides, navigation, and so on are all used for this purpose. Society, by contrast, figures as dry land. Right? So be attentive in the play when reading it with the imagery of water and the imagery also of land, specifically land related to the self. We're going to see Moore himself use this imagery in some of the dialogue, and water will be very, very recurrent throughout. Finally, in this preface, he describes this character of the common man. He's going to be a very significant character. And here's how he describes him. So he says his character is called the common man, just as there is a character called the king. And the word common was intended primarily to indicate that which is common to us all. But it was taken instead as a portrayal of that mythical beast, the man in the street. This in itself was not so bad. After all, he was intended to be something with which everyone would be able to identify. But once he was identified as common in that sense, my character was by one party accepted as a properly belittling account of that vulgar person, and by another party bitterly resented on his behalf. Myself, I had meant him to be attractive, and his philosophy impregnable. What both these parties had in common, if I may use the word, is that they thought of him as somebody else. Wherever he might have been, this common man was certainly not in the theatre. He is harder to find than a unicorn, but I must modify that. He was not in the stalls among his fashionable detractors and defenders, but in the laughter this character drew down from the gallery, that laughter which is the most heartening sound our theatre knows. I thought I heard once or twice a rueful note of recognition. So in the common man, we have this sense that he's not just supposed to be, again, the man in the street, but that which is common to us all. In other words, the playwright Bolt here is indicating that he knows that Moore is not the typical person, willing to sacrifice his own life for his own sense of self and his conscience. And the common man is closer to the regular person. But that perhaps is not a kind of regular person that we want to recognize in ourselves. The key thing to note about the common man really is that he will break the fourth wall in the play. He will address the audience directly. And so, in that sense, he will have a closer connection, perhaps, to the audience than the other characters in the play. So he's self-referential, and we see that at the very beginning of the play. Right? It starts with a common man coming on stage saying, right, it is perverse to start a play made up of kings and cardinals and speaking costumes and intellectuals with embroidered mouths with me. Right, saying that it's ridiculous to start with a common man. So he's addressing the audience at the outset. So he's self-referential, but not necessarily comedic. I mean, he's a kind of comedic character, but there's a serious to him, which is perhaps very notable. So he gives the introduction to the play, but our first actual scene is between Thomas More and his steward, who is played by the common man. So the common man plays various characters throughout. He's the steward Matthew, he's the boatman, he's the jailer, right? Because the idea is that all of these roles in society are played, even in history perhaps, by just common men. But our first significant interaction between two characters here is between our main characters, Sir Thomas More and Richard Rich, a young man looking to make his way in the world. And they're having an argument. Rich is arguing that every man has his price. This will be very significant, to say the least, throughout the play. Moore doesn't seem to believe that every man has his price. In fact, in response to Rich saying that any man can be bought with pleasure or titles or women or bricks and mortar, Moore says it's childish. So Rich responds by saying, well, in suffering, certainly. And now Moore is interested and responds, buy a man with suffering? To which Rich says, impose suffering and offer him escape. Moore says back, oh, for a moment, I thought you were being profound. Keep this in mind. Moore finds something profound in the idea that a man could be bought with suffering. Surely he wouldn't want to avoid it. And that's Rich's point. There's nothing profound about it. The idea that every man has a price, perhaps at that price, is even only to avoid suffering. What will Moore's price be? Does he have a price? And can you buy a man of suffering? What would that even mean? Especially in the context of ordinary society, but in the society of martyrs, who knows? All right, so we also get a sense of Moore's character right here at the outset. He has been given a cup as a bribe in a particular legal case. So Thomas More is a lawyer, right? And at this time, it was very common to accept bribes, but Moore is one of the only ones who does not. So he gives the cup away to Rich, who he knows needs it, and who admits that he will sell it to buy a gown. For Rich is looking to move up in the world. Moore has a job for him, but it's not the kind of job he wants. It's to be a teacher. Moore is trying to tell him that a man should go where he will not be tempted, but Rich wants to be at court, where he can grow in wealth and renown. But Moore says, why not be a teacher? You'd be a fine teacher, perhaps even a great one. But Rich says, and if I was, who would know it? Moore's answer to that is you, your pupils, and your friends. God. Not a bad public, that. Oh, and a quiet life. So we're seeing, one, what Rich is rejecting, the idea of a life without fame and fortune, right? Being a teacher where only your students and your friends and God know what you've done. That's not enough for Rich. If the court, if the realm doesn't know it, then it's not a value to him. But we see what Moore values. Despite the fact that he's a very public man, he desires the quiet life. He doesn't want all the things that Rich wants. In fact, all he really wants is respect of his family, friends, pupils, God. We also, in the very next scene, see the juxtaposition between his own character and that of the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk really, in many ways, represents the aristocracy broadly, that kind of sporting, right? He likes hunting and hawking and what have you. Not very sophisticated in terms of politics, not particularly religious, right? And willing to compromise. We see that really Moore couldn't be more different than Norfolk, although they are friends. We also see this introduction of classes. We get the first mention of the character Cromwell, who we find out has just been appointed the secretary of the cardinal. The Cardinal Wolsey, who is, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent of a prime minister in the period. He basically runs the kingdom, even though the king ultimately is still in charge. We see the disparaging response by Norfolk, right, that he would possibly be in this position, as well as Alice, Moore's wife, who could not believe that a farrier's son could possibly be the cardinal's secretary. A farrier being one who shoes horses, right, a work in iron or a blacksmith. To which Norfolk responds, well, the cardinal's a butcher's son, isn't he? Right? This is obviously a point of derision that the cardinal, who's one of the most powerful, richest men, probably the most powerful, most rich, next only to the king, right, is the son of a mere butcher. We also see what is expected of the character of Cromwell. Alice says, it'll be quick up and quick down with Master Cromwell. We'll see in the play, perhaps, that sense of the up and down fortunes of the characters. But as the scene ends, we do get this final little interaction between Rich and the steward. The steward believes that Rich took the cup initially, but Rich explains that no, it was given to him as a gift. And this is what the steward thinks about Moore and his giving habits. He says, my master, Thomas Moore, would give anything to anyone. Some say that's good, and some say that's bad, but I say he can't help it, and that's bad. Because someday, someone's going to ask him for something that he wants to keep, and he'll be out of practice. It must be something that he wants to keep. It's only common sense. Well, we're going to see in the play what it is that Moore wants to keep, what he's not willing to part with. And it's nothing material, nothing like a silver cup. Something far more integral to his sense of self. So in the next scene, we have Thomas Moore interacting with Cardinal Wolsey, and we get this kind of ironic interaction with. So a cardinal is a very high position in the Roman Catholic Church, but he has a secular position in the government of the king, and he's clearly a very secular person. Whereas Moore has a secular position as a lawyer, is clearly far more religious than the cardinal. We also get a sense that Moore is more of an idealist with regards to politics, as opposed to the more pragmatic Wolsey. Right, who says, you're a constant regret to me, Thomas. If you could just see facts flat on, without that horrible moral squint, with just a little common sense, you could have been a statesman. In other words, indicating that to be a good statesman, one ought not to have very strong moral principles. Indeed, that's precisely how he is acting at the moment. He's trying to exert influence on the papacy to bring about the annulment, that is to say, the dissolution of the marriage of the king. And this kind of pragmatic approach is very much not in keeping with the approach of Moore, who is reproached by the cardinal for not being active enough, again, this theme of activity versus passivity, in trying to help the king get an annulment. And the only, or to produce an heir at least, which Moore says he is praying for. So Moore notes that we shall have my prayers to fall back on. Wolsey is rather derisive about this. You'd like that, wouldn't you, to govern the country by prayers? Moore says, yes, I should. Wolsey's response is, I'd like to be there when you try." So obviously he does not believe that this is a legitimate way to actually think about policy. And in that, Moore and Wolsey could not be more different. So they do not exactly part on the best terms, and Moore goes to return home on a boat on the water. So again, keep in mind this imagery of boats and water and what it represents. But before he goes onto the river, we have this interaction between another character. Well, first between Moore and Cromwell, and then again, right after that, between Moore and Chapuis. So Chapuis is the ambassador to Spain. So the alliance between Spain and England is based in the marriage, but of course things are now strained. Henry is trying to get rid of his wife, which is an insult to Spain, an insult to the King of Spain, an emperor. And so England and Spain are moving closer and closer to becoming enemies. And it seems that Chapuis, who is a very religious man, believes that as a fellow pious Catholic, Moore might perhaps be on his side. But Moore is less than forthcoming about exactly the nature of the meeting. It doesn't seem like in any way he wants to collude with Chapuis. And instead, he goes away onto the river, which he notes, the river looks very black tonight. Again, keep in mind this imagery of not only water, but the idea of this black water. Upon returning home, we get another scene with Moore and a character that is going to act as a bit of a foil to Moore's character, who is very unmoving in his opinions. We get Roper, who's much more changeable. Roper is very much against the Catholic Church and is trying to move for Reformation. And Moore says to him, "Listen, Roper, 2 years ago you were a passionate churchman. Now you're a passionate Lutheran. We must just pray that when your head's finished turning, your face is to the front again." In other words, he's indicating that this man who is in his house trying to court his daughter, he wants to marry Moore's daughter, Margaret, which Moore will have none of, is changeable, right? His head is constantly turning around at the opinions, whereas we get this sense of Moore as a character that his head isn't turning around, it's generally looking in one direction. But we also get a sense that Moore has respect, nevertheless, for Roper's principles, even if they're different from his own, and even if they change. So he says, for instance, to his daughter, even though he's just finished saying that she can never marry him for as long as he's a heretic, and that's absolute, he says, "Nice boy, terribly strong principles, though." There's a sense that he actually respects his principles while at the same time disagreeing with them. And that's why he hopes that eventually his changing principles will eventually align with his own. Meanwhile, we have, at this point, the discussion of the fall of Wolsey, as it seems could happen. That perhaps if Wolsey could not guarantee the end of the king's marriage, he will fall. And some see this as desirable, that perhaps Moore could benefit and become chancellor himself. But Moore says, if Wolsey fell, the splash would swamp a few small boats like ours. Again, the sense of that imagery of the water and this idea of swamping, of being enveloped in a kind of tide. But nevertheless, that is exactly what happens. We get a commentary on the situation by the common man, who says, reading from a document, "Whether we follow tradition in ascribing Wolsey's death to a broken heart, or accept Professor Lacombe's less feeling diagnosis of pulmonary pneumonia, its effective cause was the king's displeasure. He died at Leicester on the 29th of November, 1530, while on his way to the Tower under charge of high treason. England's next Lord Chancellor was Sir Thomas More, a scholar and, by popular repute, a saint. His scholarship is supported by his writings. Saintliness is a quality less easy to establish. But from his willful indifference to realities which were obvious to quite ordinary contemporaries, it seems all too probable that he had it." So, despite his desire to not be swamped in the tide, Moore at this point is now Chancellor. And it is in this public role initially that we will see his sense of selfhood, his conscience put to the test. And we are going to see how his own manifestation of his principles is going to be far different than others. More passive, perhaps, but any less heroic? Well, maybe. We'll see. In the next video, we will look at the rest of this act and the second act of the play as Thomas More moves more closely to his final end and the final conclusion as to whether or not he can reconcile his own sense of self with the society around him. And we will consider whether or not the heroism that's exhibited by this hero is truly passive, or is that activeness simply something which is much more difficult to see